The Subcommittee on Space and Aeronautics will come to order. Good morning. Welcome to today's hearing entitled An Overview of the Office of Commercial Space Transportation Budget for Fiscal Year 2013. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosures for today's witness panel. At this time, I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Welcome to today's hearing on the President's 2013 budget request for the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation. I want to thank our witnesses, Dr. George Nield and Capt. Wilbur Trafton, for joining us. I know that many people put in a lot of effort preparing for these hearings, and we appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedules to appear before the subcommittee. I also want to assure you that we greatly value your expertise and wisdom, and your testimony will benefit this committee in the weeks and months ahead as we endeavor to better improve the policies that will guide our nation's evolving commercial space program. The Office of Commercial Space Transportation, known as AST, has successfully licensed over 200 launches since 1984 without loss of life, serious injury, or property damage to the general public, which is a notable record in this inherently risky business. AST's mission is to ensure the protection of the public, property, and the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States during commercial launch or re-entry activities. Currently, AST has 14 active launch licenses and 8 spaceport licenses and is working with SpaceX and Orbital Sciences for the upcoming NASA COTS and commercial resupply service missions. Additionally, AST is coordinating with NASA for licensing the suborbital flight opportunities program, as well as working toward the day when commercial crew demonstration flights will begin. The AST budget proposal for fiscal year 2013 includes a 2% increase, which is intended to allow AST to double the number of staff and field offices in anticipation of potentially up to 40 launch and re-entry operations in 2013. This significant increase reflects several launches for ISS cargo resupply and long-anticipated flights in the suborbital tourism market. The recently passed FAA reauthorization bill includes an extension of the regulatory moratorium on commercial human spaceflight systems to October 2015. It is my hope that FAA will use this time to engage with industry stakeholders on its regulatory approach and licensing standards to prepare the path forward for a proposed rulemaking. It is also critical that a delineation of roles and responsibilities among FAA's various offices be clearly articulated to ensure that industry won't be hindered by duplication or ambiguous requirements. With these developments in mind, I do have some concerns with NASA's use of Space Act agreements, inasmuch as they cannot impose safety requirements on program participants. And considering that FAA will not be able to promulgate human spaceflight regulations for several years, I realize that AST has a significant amount of work ahead as it endeavors to align its regulatory approach with evolving industry approaches to safety, all the while having to comply with the moratorium. We will be closely monitoring the collaboration between FAA and NASA in this area to ensure these agencies avoid conflicting or duplication of responsibilities while balancing authority for commercial space operations on NASA missions. I am pleased to note that AST is working closely with range partners at the Wallops Flight Facility, the U.S. Air Force at the Eastern and Western Ranges, and NASA offices at Johnson Space Center and Kennedy. These relationships help accomplish our national objectives to further NASA priorities with commercial space industry support. AST also carries the dual mission to encourage, facilitate, and promote the U.S. commercial space transportation industry. While I trust that safety is the highest priority for this agency, I would like to better understand how AST balances this dual mission. This is especially important when evaluating the responsibility that AST shares with the Aviation Safety Branch of the FAA on newly developed hybrid vehicles that will share the national airspace system with transport and general aviation aircraft. The AST budget also proposes funding for the Center of Excellence for Commercial Space Transportation, described as a cost-sharing partnership of academia, industry, and government entities focusing on research of primary interest to AST and U.S. commercial space industry. The Center of Excellence is a consortium of 8 universities. While it has been funded for the past 2 years from the FAA's R&D account, AST now plans to include this $1 million operation to its base budget. I'm happy to see this office engage with the best and brightest minds in our universities, and I look forward to learning more about research projects, outcomes, and contributions the consortium is achieving to help advance the role of commercial space. As I close, I'd like to commend Dr. Nield and his agency on AST's impressive safety record. While I understand that AST's core business operations focus on maintaining this record, there are numerous challenges ahead as the industry anticipates a period of high growth. Keeping in mind interagency coordination, budgets, and the vagueness of the marketplace in an eager emergent industry, the upcoming years are sure to offer exciting innovations as we work to maintain U.S. leadership in space. I now recognize our ranking member, Jerry Costello, for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding today's hearing to review the FY13 budget request for the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation. The successful growth of commercial human spaceflight activities can open new opportunities for commercial space. However, realizing and sustaining the promise of that industry will require close attention to safety. As ranking member of the Subcommittee of Transportation and Infrastructure, the Subcommittee on Aviation, I have a great appreciation, I think, for the expectations of the flying public. The public needs a clear understanding of the risk involved with commercial space transportation, and it will need to be convinced that those risks are being effectively managed. AST will be at the center of establishing those expectations, as it will have a critical role in ensuring the safety of would-be space tourists and potentially even NASA astronauts or other spaceflight participants. Although commercial human spaceflight vehicles are in varying stages of design and development, important policy questions have yet to be resolved. To name a few, how will safety regulations be developed? 2, will the government extend liability protection to the new industry? 3, how will the safety of commercial operations on orbit be managed? And is AST's role as both a regulator and promoter of commercial spaceflight industry, is that an appropriate role for the agency? Mr. Chairman, I hope this is the first of many discussions that Congress and the FAA and key stakeholders will have to address these important issues. I look forward to hearing from the Associate Administrator on the challenges facing AST and what actions, if any, are needed to help address those challenges. In addition, I'm interested in hearing from the perspectives on AST's role and responsibility, and especially in light of his past experience in leading NASA's human spaceflight activities. I'm very interested in hearing Captain Trafton's perspective on these issues. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for yielding the time to me, and I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses, and we certainly will have some questions for them after their testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Costello. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I would like to introduce our panel of witnesses, and then we will proceed to hear from each of them in order. Our first witness is Dr. George Nield, Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation at the Federal Aviation Administration. Dr. Nield is a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy and has over 30 years of aerospace experience with the Air Force, NASA, and in private industry. Dr. Nield came to FAA from the Orbital Sciences Corporation, where he served as Senior Scientist for the Advanced Programs Group. Next, we will hear from retired United States Navy Captain Wilbur Trafton, who is Chairman of the Commercial Space Advisory Committee. Captain Trafton is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He served 26 years in the Navy, flying combat missions in Southeast Asia and serving in command positions. He also has extensive experience in industry and served as Associate Administrator for Spaceflight at NASA. Captain, thank you for joining us this morning. Thanks again to everybody here. And as our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each. After all witnesses have spoken, members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. I now recognize our first witness, Dr. George Nield, to present his testimony.
Chairman Palazzo, Ranking Member Costello, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to meet with you today to update you on the ongoing activities in commercial space transportation by the Federal Aviation Administration and on some of the recent developments in the industry. With NASA's retirement of the Space Shuttle, we are undergoing an historic change in the U.S. space program. The final mission of Atlantis in July of last year left many wondering about the future of space transportation in this country. While it is certainly true that the launch marked the end of an era, it also represented the beginning of what I am confident will be an exciting future for our nation in space. Today, I would like to give you my perspective on that future and to highlight some of the ways that the FAA and the commercial space transportation industry are dealing with the challenges that we will be facing in the years ahead. The FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation has a twofold mission: to ensure public safety during commercial launch and reentry activities, and to encourage, facilitate, and promote commercial space transportation. To carry out our safety responsibilities, we develop and issue regulations, grant licenses, permits, and safety approvals, and conduct safety inspections during each and every licensed or permitted launch. We are also responsible for licensing the operation of launch and reentry sites, or spaceports as they are popularly known. Since 1996, we have licensed the operation of 8 different spaceports around the country. I'm very proud of the men and women who work in our office and of our outstanding safety record. Since 1989, we have licensed 205 launches without any loss of life, serious injuries, or significant property damage to the general public. Currently, as you know, the U.S. must rely on other nations to deliver supplies to our astronauts on board the International Space Station. Over the next several months, 2 different American companies, SpaceX and Orbital Sciences Corporation, are planning to demonstrate their ability to take on that responsibility. Those missions will be licensed by the FAA, and we are working closely with both companies and with NASA to ensure their success. While it may well be several years before we see U.S. rockets carrying people again all the way to orbit, there is plenty of work going on right now that is aimed at ending our reliance on foreign entities to transport crew members to and from the International Space Station. American companies are eager to show that they can do the job as part of the Commercial Crew Development Program. The FAA is working directly with the interested companies and with NASA to ensure public safety during those launches whenever they take place. Suborbital space tourism represents another important segment of the industry. Several companies are currently in the process of designing, building, and testing vehicles that will be capable of carrying people up to the edge of space, with maximum altitudes in excess of 100 kilometers. Based on market studies, we expect to see this type of activity result in a billion-dollar industry within the next 10 years. To support these and other activities, the President's FY 2013 budget request for our office is $16.7 million, which provides for the equivalent of 73 full-time employees. Our FY 2013 request represents an increase of $429,000 over our FY 2012 enacted budget. Based on industry launch manifests and planned flight test programs, we are forecasting a significant increase in launch and reentry operations in 2013. We are already performing initial safety analyses for some of the new launch systems that are planned to be operational next year. The FAA stands ready to support our future in commercial space transportation. With your help and leadership, that future will not only inspire the nation, it will also create new jobs, produce new technologies, and expand our reach into the universe. Again, I'm honored by this opportunity to come before you today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Nield. I now recognize Captain Trafton for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you. Is that better? Thank you, Chairman Palazzo, Congressman Costello, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the invitation to participate in this hearing today regarding the FAA AST budget request for 2013. I'm here in my role as chairman of the Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee. As you know, COMSTAC provides information, advice, and recommendations to the administrator of the FAA within the Department of Transportation on critical matters concerning the U.S. commercial space transportation industry. COMSTAC membership is made up of senior executives from the commercial space transportation industry, representatives from the satellite industry, both manufacturers and users, state and local government officials, representatives from firms providing insurance, financial, and legal services for commercial space activities, and representatives from academia, space advocacy organizations, and industry organizations. We meet twice a year in May and October in Washington, D.C. in a public forum. The primary goals of this committee are to evaluate economic, technological, and institutional developments relating to the U.S. commercial transportation industry, provide a forum for the discussion of problems involving the relationship between industry activities and government requirements, make recommendations to the administrator on issues and approaches for federal policies and programs regarding the industry. The commercial space industry represents the spirit and roots of America, exploration and entrepreneurship. The commercial industry plays an important role in stimulating investment in infrastructure and creating opportunity, jobs, and ultimately a U.S. capability, increasing value to the U.S. taxpayer. This role is increasingly important as commercial space passenger travel emerges as a new business. I'm not going to read the rest of the statement. I thought the questions that were asked of me in the letter, invitation letter, are right on the mark, and I have answered them as you can see to the best of my ability, the committee's ability. A few wrap-up remarks. Commercial space is here to stay. There are those, particularly some astronauts, who don't agree with that. And everyone's entitled to their opinion. I found it interesting on 60 Minutes Sunday night that they only chose 2 astronauts who don't like commercial space and didn't choose a couple who feel the other way. Some areas requiring immediate action, and this is from COMSTAC, and I'll be prepared to answer your questions and discuss these with you. Cooperation with NASA. Regulations, cargo missions, crew missions, who regulates, who operates, AST resources. Does AST have the resources to handle the workload that's coming? And there is an increase in workload coming. Indemnification, it has to be extended at least for a year. On balance, that's the best thing for the industry, for the country, and we COMSTAC would just like to get that behind us as soon as possible. On-orbit authority, I think the committee, I understand where the committee's coming from, but everybody in the room needs to understand that once on-orbit authority is given, AST isn't going to be able to suddenly step up with regulations, policies. It's going to be several years before AST is up to speed and regulating the industry. Export controls need some work, and I'm prepared to discuss that. I think that the entrepreneurs that are working the suborbital world are doing a great thing for our country. And I will say U.S., Russia, China, and the SpaceX, if you watched the other night, think about that. 3 countries and 1 U.S. company have put a capsule up and then brought it back to Earth. That completes my remarks, sir, and I'm ready to answer your questions.
Thank you, Captain Trafton. Thank the panel for their testimony. Reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will at this point open the round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Dr. Nield, this is basically a 3-part question. What will be AST's approach to regulating orbital and suborbital crew launch systems? How will AST's regulatory regime differ from requirements NASA imposes on launch systems that may be contracted to carry NASA astronauts? And finally, will AST's approach distinguish between orbital and suborbital launch systems, or will it be the same basic set of requirements? And I'll go back. To the first question, or first part, what will be AST's approach to regulating orbital and suborbital crew launch systems?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our approach for overseeing the launches that we have coming up consists of looking at both the impact on public safety and the impact on crew members and spaceflight participants. In terms of the public safety, we have our regulatory framework in place today. We have a good safety record. We have a licensing and permitting scheme that we believe has done a good job of ensuring their continued safety. What's new, as you point out, is carrying people on board these rockets. And we have some very top-level regulations which Congress asked us to develop following the Commercial Spaceflight Amendments Act of 2004. However, in conjunction with that legislation and the recent FAA authorization, we were asked to hold off on additional regulations that were designed to ensure the safety of crew members or spaceflight participants until, as you mentioned, in October 1st, 2015. So our approach at this point is to continue to work with industry, with NASA, and with other key stakeholders to understand what kinds of things would make sense for a regulatory environment so that when the learning period is over, when we've gained additional experience in these types of flights, that we would be prepared to put in place a regulatory system that is rational, it would maximize our safety, and would not be a burden to the industry. In terms of what's different with NASA, NASA is free to impose whatever requirements it believes are appropriate for its NASA astronauts, and it can do that through the contracts that it lets with industry. Our focus today is on public safety. We want to work with NASA, though, to make sure that none of our requirements are either conflicting or otherwise confusing the requirements that NASA wants to put in place. That will be very important to ensure that the government is consistent in its requirements. In terms of the differences between orbital and suborbital, our basic approach is the same, but because those environments are so different, I think we have the opportunity to be a little bit more methodical with suborbital spaceflight. That is a lot more like aircraft flight test, where you're expanding the envelope. You can take it flight by flight, step by step, in terms of the speeds and the altitudes, and the amount of time that the crew and spaceflight participants are exposed to the hazards of space is relatively short. For orbital flights, once you've left the pad, you're going, and it's probably going to be days or even weeks that you're exposed to that harsh environment. So I think it'll be very important that we have a good sense of requirements as we come up on orbital space flight. The suborbital flight, I think the framework that Congress has put in place with informed consent and a step-by-step evolutionary process will be very adequate.
Dr. Nield, this question is also for you. On March 9, 2012, just 11 days ago, your office published in the Federal Register a request for proposals for the Space Transportation Infrastructure Matching Grants Program. How would your office fund grant applications given there's no funding identified in fiscal year 2012?
I believe that the Spaceport Matching Grants Program is a very effective program. We have given $500,000 in each of 2 years, in 2010 and 2011. The first year was specifically at the direction of the Congress. Last year and potentially this year, if we give out those grant funds, it would be basically taking out of our hide in terms of the amount that we already have available. But we think that the FAA has a very great model in terms of the Airport Improvement Grant Program that is very successful in helping our national infrastructure to be modernized and fully equipped to meet our needs for aviation transportation. As we move forward with commercial space transportation, we think similar models where you have matching grants, some federal funding, and some from local or private entities would enable us to maximize safety and help the national infrastructure to be prepared for the future. Unfortunately, in the current tough economic times, we have to prioritize all of our activities. And so looking forward, you'll notice that we are not asking for funding in 2013 for the grants program. We think it would make sense to continue to look at that in the future to see if that is something that we're able to accommodate, but we would not be able to give out grants in 2013 according to our current plans.
Right. But just to finish up on the documentation that I'm looking at, there's no money set aside for spaceport grants in 2012. So, but we're putting out a proposal for applications, but there's no money available. So this is just or do you have money that has not been used from prior periods?
So to answer that, in the Federal Register notice, we warn people that we may not be able to have funds available. However, we are carefully managing our resources this year as we go through the year to see if we might be able to have some small amount available.
And were the funds available, in your view, would space transportation grants take priority over your other regulatory and safety responsibilities?
I'd have to say safety is number one, but the grants can be very important in terms of helping the industry to be safe and mature going forward.
Okay, thank you. My time's up. Mr. Costello?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Captain Trafton, in your opinion, is the AST budget request for fiscal year 2013 adequate to carry out their mission?
Mr. Costello, yes, sir, I think it is. As I mentioned, we see a tremendous workload coming for AST. When one looks at the suborbital and orbital flights on the horizon, and yes, I know that the numbers aren't there if you look back, but if you look forward, they certainly are there. And just some companies, suborbital, are talking about flying 30 times a year. And when you put that package together and you look at all the pre-license issue work that needs to be done to lay the groundwork and the meetings, and then finally issue the license, and then follow the license, issuing a license in the end of their activity. So I think it's extremely important that AST be funded to do to perform their regulatory role, and I absolutely think that their budget request for 2013 is justified.
In your opinion, what should AST's priorities be for fiscal year 13?
Well, Dr. Nield has already said it. The priority is safety, always. The work with NASA, the collaboration with NASA is extremely important. And I have to say, in the interest of full disclosure, I sit on the NASA Commercial Space Committee. And it's gotten very interesting. We never meet now on this committee or that committee that we don't talk about the relationship between NASA and the FAA. And it's interesting that we are of one opinion on both sides. The FAA will be the regulatory agency for crew and cargo missions, suborbital and orbital. Yes, we need to work the hard details with NASA, but that's a given from these two committees. Again, just looking forward, I can count 40 flights right on the horizon. 5 traditional EOVs, 5 cargo to ISS, 20 suborbital research, and 40 and 10 Virgin Atlantic, for example, tourist flights. So there's 40 right on the horizon. So I think they need to be plussed up.
Thank you. Dr. Nield, you made mention that in the FAA reauthorization, in the act that was passed recently, the reauthorization, it postpones AST's ability to regulate until October of 2015. But there is a statement, of course, that is attached to that does not prohibit AST from moving forward. So I guess my question is, What is AST doing at the present time regarding the authority that the reauthorization bill gives you?
So we are still looking at that legislation and discussing it with our council to understand exactly what we can and cannot do. We very much appreciate the guidance from Congress that encourages us to work with industry, because we believe that is very important to get these regulations correct. In terms of what we're doing right now, frankly, we are going through line by line all of the extensive requirements that NASA has developed for its own human rating requirement set, and we are looking at which of those would be applicable to non-NASA missions. And we're going through for each discipline and trying to understand what would that look like if we weren't supporting NASA for the International Space Station. So that's a work in progress. The worst thing that could happen, I think, would be for us to just sit back and when an accident occurs, we would scramble around and try to put some regulations in place. That is not the right solution. So it's very important that we work with all the stakeholders, industry, NASA, and the other interested parties now to start developing what that regulatory framework would look like. And when it's right, then we'll be ready to go forward.
Thank you. Finally, Captain Trafton, you make mention in your statement about recommendations for government and industry to share information and transparency, how important it is. I'm pleased to hear you say that NASA and the FAA are working close together. On my other hat with the Subcommittee on Aviation, Transportation, and Infrastructure, we had a problem when it came to trying to get agencies to work together concerning NextGen. And not always did we have the cooperation, not only of the agencies working together, but the stakeholders working together. So I guess my question to you is, do you have a model in mind for a system to exchange data between the governmental agencies and industry?
No, sir. The short answer is no, I don't have a model in mind. We have discussed this subject at length within the COMSTAC. It is clear to us that there has to be an exchange of safety information. AST has a lot of safety background, experience, information that they can share, as does NASA. So we know it's there. We know they need to share it. We have talked about it in our recommendations to Dr. Nield, but we don't have a model yet.
Well, I hope sooner rather than later that there is a model that is developed. And as I said, I think as far as transparency and governmental agencies working together with private industry concerning NextGen, we had some bumps in the road early on, but I think many of those have been worked out. So I hope we don't repeat that regarding this program. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Brooks from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Nield, I'm looking at committee staff notes, and they say, quote, AST issued its first launch license in 1989 and since then has licensed 205 launches with no fatalities, serious injuries, or significant damage to the uninvolved public, end quote. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, it is, Mr. Brooks.
And then they also give me notes that state that, quote, during the previous year only one launch license was issued, end quote. Is that correct?
It depends on how you count the events and what fiscal years you're talking about. For example, this hearing is designed to look at the fiscal years. So if we look at the last fiscal year, 2011, then we had actually 5 launches, of which 3 were licensed and 2 were permitted. So we have all of those numbers available and can answer which particular question that you had in mind.
And if I understand it correctly, your budget request assumes dramatic growth in the launch rate during the coming fiscal year, noting that up to 40 launches and reentries could occur. Is that a fair characterization by committee staff?
Yes, sir, it is.
What is it that causes you to believe that we would have a jump of, say, 5 launches and 2 or 3 licenses up to as many as 40?
The factors that go into that assessment are that this is a new and growing industry. If you look at the last 25 years, almost all of the launches were for the same basic purpose, to launch a satellite, such as a telecommunications satellite, into orbit. And the level of business for that part of the industry is continuing today, and we expect it will continue going forward without much change. But there are several new segments that we see just on the horizon that we think will greatly increase the activity. And so those include the commercial cargo flights to the space station to support NASA. That is something we've never had before. NASA has contracts for $3.5 billion for those two companies to provide those 20 flights over the next few years. So we know that's going to start soon, probably this year. We have the commercial cargo flights, again in support of NASA. We also have the suborbital activities, both for scientific research and for space tourism. And all of those segments are starting. We've got companies actually making designs, building hardware, assembling things, and conducting tests. So exactly when those launches will start is hard to predict, but it looks very, very clear that it's going to be in the next 1 to 2 years. So that's the basis for our projections.
With respect to FY 2012, how many launches have already occurred that required oversight by the Office of Commercial Space Transportation?
None so far.
So that would be none over the past 5 months.
That's correct.
And we have 7 more months in this fiscal year. How many launches are currently on the calendar with set dates?
That's a great question. For industry, we don't have published launch dates the way we are used to seeing them from government operations. But as we talk to the various companies, I think it's quite possible we'll get to 10 to 12 launches by the end of the year. And
so you think we'd have 10 to 12 launches over the next 7 months?
Yes, sir.
Now, your budget, as I understand it, for fiscal year 2011 was roughly $15 million. During that time frame, we had 4 or 5 launches, if I understand you correctly. And then FY12 enacted is a little over $16 million. And if I understand it, you're now looking at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, somewhere in that neighborhood for the remainder of this fiscal year, although so far, for the first 5 months, we've had 0. And yet, you're testifying that it's going to jump up to around 40, far more than historical averages for FY13, but you're having a requested only a 2.6% increase in your budget. How is that going to work, where you have a 2.6% increase in your budget request, but you're looking at 4 times as many launches as the historical average?
It is going to be a significant challenge. The way we hope to accomplish that is by working efficiently, by using this time when we've had few launches to set up the organization, to do training, to develop policies, to be ready to go so that when the activity starts to build, we're prepared to do that. There are many different metrics that go into deciding how many resources we really need to accomplish the job. Launches is one of those, but there are other things too. How many applications for licenses? How many for permits? How many field offices do we have? How many regulatory rulemaking activities are underway and so forth? So we've tried to develop a staffing model that will help us get a sense for that, and we're starting to use that to provide our request to the committee.
Thank you, Dr. Nield. And if the chairman will excuse me, I've got a concurrent Armed Services Committee meeting.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Edwards from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. In a couple of iterations on this subcommittee, I've had questions regarding liability and indemnification for commercial space launch, and so I want to focus on that for the time being. Dr. Nield, the government industry shared liability and indemnification regime for commercial launch systems, whether that's unmanned satellite launches or ones that could carry passengers under the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act, is set to expire on December 31st of this year. What, if any, changes to the regime are needed in light of the evolution of commercial space transportation?
That's an excellent question. With your permission, I'd like to just talk a little bit about indemnification itself. Because
Just remember that I only have 5 minutes, so thank you, though.
Okay, so this is a very important question. Perhaps we can discuss it in further questions. To get right to the issues that you're asking about, the recommendations that COMSTAC, for example, has made relating to indemnification are that we consider having it renewed for more than a few years, perhaps 10 years, or even making it permanent, and lifting the cap, which is currently $1.5 billion. So those are the specific changes that have been proposed that could improve the system. But I think in general, we definitely need to extend the regime, and there are a number of reasons for that, which I'd be happy to discuss further later.
Well, let me just ask you that, and I apologize. I don't mean to cut you off. We just get these time limits, and it drives us crazy. But I'm curious as to where the liability should be, because let's just separate unmanned from missions that would carry crew. Isn't it true, though, that one part of that industry is fairly mature in terms of the technology? So why is it that on the commercial side, the taxpayers should basically enjoy pretty much all the risk, and the companies engaged in the activity bear really not a lot of the risk?
I would say that that would not be an accurate representation of the current situation. So if you go back to the terminology itself, the word indemnification really does not explain what the regime is that Congress has put in place. A more accurate assessment would be to call it a conditional payment of excess third-party claims. Now, briefly, what does that mean? It's conditional. Congress would have to appropriate funds after an accident before it would happen. It doesn't happen automatically. It's third-party, so we're not talking about a wealthy space tourist getting reimbursed or his heirs. We're talking about protecting the general public's interests should they have damage or injury. And we're talking about excess payments. Our office does an assessment before each launch to develop a maximum probable loss, how much damage we think could happen during that launch. We set that as the amount of insurance that the company has to put in place. And it's only if the accident exceeds that in terms of damage that this regime kicks in. So with that as the basis to understand it, do we need it? Yes, we think it is necessary for industry to be internationally competitive. And what is the cost to the taxpayer? Well, it's been in place since 1988. The cost has been zero.
Well, but we're also entering a different environment for commercial launches, too. It isn't the environment that we've been in since 1988. I mean, that's the whole premise of the budget that we're putting in place looking forward. And Captain Trafton's testimony and his belief that, there's a lot of a fairly robust industry there. And so I guess, although I understand the regime, my question just has much more to do with, why is it that the industry itself fully doesn't bear the responsibility to the public in the event of an accident?
So I think it would be appropriate for Captain Trafton to respond, but my assessment is this is a shared risk regime on purpose because of the high risk and the potential high damage that is involved.
Captain Trafton?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Edwards. First of all, as I stated earlier, COMSTAC would be perfectly happy if the Congress would extend indemnification for another year, and then let's work the fine details. But we need it, and we need it to be competitive internationally. Everybody else has this. It's on balance. It's good for the United States. It's good for the U.S. industry, and it makes our industry competitive. And without it, our industry will suffer. Russia takes care of theirs. Europe takes care of theirs. China takes care of their launch providers. We need to do the same.
Thank you.
Thank you, and also for the subcommittee's personal knowledge, we are going to be having a hearing on indemnification in late spring, latter half of May, and we're hoping to have the GAO, who's conducting an extensive analysis of the market right now, to be able to come be one of our witnesses. So, at this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Rohrabacher from California.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a little bit on limited liability, which of course is, I think, a very serious issue and should be discussed, but we should put this in perspective to new and developing industries as well as industries that we have. There is certainly limited liability has been put in place for the nuclear industry, and we are about to step into a whole new era of nuclear power plants that are totally safe and will save our country. I mean, they will. But we would never reach that stage if the early part of developing that industry, if there wasn't limited liability. Let me note we have limited liability for aviation, for our airlines and other airlines in the development of the airline business. That too, I think we can be proud that we have come so far so quickly in the field of aviation. And let us also note that if we don't want the government to run everything, the government has limited liability. I mean, everything it does. And you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe NASA can be sued, and it's part of the United States government. So if we don't look at limited liability as something that's part of what we want to do to develop this new commercial industry, which will save the taxpayers enormous amounts of money, limited liability has to be part of that discussion. I was, of course, here, and I'm the author of the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004, and I'd like to note that we created the moratorium that we have on these restrictions on new restrictions to the industry to give the industry 8 years not only to develop and design, test, and evaluate new systems, but also to gain significant flight experience. In addition, we designed this learning period to give ample time for the FAA to understand these systems and create needed regulations based on real data, not on speculation. At that time, if we'd gone right into it, we'd have been creating regulations and setting down the ground rules for things we didn't even know about yet, because no one had ever done them. So what we need to do is to make sure that when we do get into this field, and I know there's an extension now of 3 more years, we haven't progressed as much as we thought we were going to. But after 3 more years, let's make sure in these years we get the data we need to make sure that regulation that is justified and the structure that these private companies can operate on, that we set up something that's workable and safe. And if it's not safe, it's not workable. We know that. And can you, just to get down to some of the maybe things we might be doing, do you see NASA as a regulator of commercial launch systems, even in a situation when NASA is not the customer, doesn't bear any relationship to the economic deal that's being made?
We're working very closely with NASA, but in discussions with NASA leaders, NASA recognizes that they are not set up as a regulatory organization. That is the proper role for the FAA or similar agency. NASA has a lot of experience, a lot of expertise, and they're doing some great things, especially in exploration.
Right. NASA has NASA has the leading role to play in space exploration. NASA has a leading role to play in pushing us and pushing back the frontiers. I don't see NASA as playing a leading role in regulating the economic activities of other entities in space. There is a significant difference between the regulatory mission of AST protecting the uninvolved public and the regulatory mission of most of the rest of NASA, FAA. So how does this influence your office and how it operates as compared to the rest of the FAA?
Like the rest of the FAA, we're focused on safety, and we have a lot of experience and expertise that we can take advantage of in trying to apply to these new activities. What's different, though, about our industry is it's a new industry. We don't have 100 years' worth of experience such that we've developed all the lessons learned, all the factors to look at. And we want, as a nation, to encourage innovation, creativity, and to figure out how we can build safer, more reliable, more cost-effective vehicles in the future. So that's the balance that we want to try to achieve. Safety is number one, but let's allow some innovation.
Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that we have done what's right. Sometimes you look back and Congress has done exactly the wrong thing to achieve the goals that they've set out, but we are doing this in a very systematic way. And within a few years, we've seen this commercial space group expand, and the amount of money coming in to space activities from the commercial side expand. So if we just keep on this very responsible approach, I think we'll have a great new industry for this country and for the world that we'll be proud of. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Adams from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to some of my colleagues were asking you a question, and I'm trying to understand your rationale for what you believe is going to be. I believe you said 10 to 12 over the next 7 months of launches or whatever, because in 2009 you issued 5 experimental licenses to suborbital companies. In 10, you issued 4, and you issued 0 in 2011. Your written testimony to this committee was May of 2011. You stated, in FY12, we expect several dozen licensed or permitted launches. Although most of those missions will involve suborbital launches, it still will be quite a change. Now, you said you're still expecting those several dozen, or now it's 10 to 12. So you're still expecting a dozen this year, launches this year?
Yes, ma'am.
How many licenses are currently on track to issue, are you on track to issue this year for this FY12?
I don't have the number of licenses at my fingertip. I think it's important to look at both the launches and the licenses as separate events. We can certainly get you that information.
So you don't know how many licenses are on track, but you still believe 10 to 12 over the next 7 months.
Yes.
But you can't quantify that with anything that you brought here today. Is that correct? Yes or no? I mean, and I'll move on to my other questions.
It's a subjective issue. I'm happy to give you my best guess.
I'd like to see some actual figures, if you could. I would love to.
We can get to that.
That would be great. You know, the mission statement of AST is partially to encourage, facilitate, and promote U.S. commercial space transportation. However, your mandate is to ensure the protection of public safety and property as well. Necessarily, this includes regulating and investigating violations of regulations in the industry. I have concerns about AST being both a regulator and a promoter of the commercial space industry. Can you tell the committee your strategy to mitigate the conflict between these two parts of your mission as the commercial market continues to mature?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Safety is number one. That takes priority. We will never compromise safety. At the same time, in accordance with the guidance that Congress has given us, we are asked to encourage, facilitate, and promote. So what does that mean? We do a number of different things. We try to collect and distribute information that we think is helpful to the industry, things like launch forecasts, economic impact assessments, various bits of information that we think could be of benefit to the companies that are actually working in the industry. We also put out guide documents or other reports that might be of interest to the industry. We hold pre-application consultations. We have workshops to help industry to understand our regulations and what we're expecting them to do when we license them. And then finally, we look at the environment in the interagency community, working with NASA, working with the Congress, and to try to identify any particular obstacles to helping industry to be successful. And we think we can do all of those without compromising safety. So that's what we try to do.
Well, obviously, NASA has extensive experience in putting people and things up into space.
Yes.
It's what they've been doing for decades. So can you tell the committee how AST plans to ensure that they are not stepping on NASA's mission, and what you are doing to ensure there are no overlaps between NASA's safety guidelines under the Space Act agreements during the CCDV, CCDEV, and CCI and Capt programs, and your safety requirements for licensure?
Yes, we work very closely with NASA. Some of the things we've done are to assign our employees. We have one in the Commercial Crew Program Office at the Kennedy Space Center. We have other people nearby at Patrick Air Force Base. We have two at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. We have regular telecons with our NASA counterparts, and as I mentioned, we're going through the NASA requirements right now to try and understand which things should directly apply and which things may not be applicable to the commercial activities.
And what are you doing to tell the, can you tell the committee what AST is doing to work with the industry to ensure that everyone understands what you're planning to do in the way of regulatory action?
One of the prime things that we do is to work with our advisory committee, COMSTAC. We meet twice a year. We try to share our progress and invite their questions, comments, or concerns so that we can address them in a quick and responsive way.
Thank you. At this time, we're going to move into a second round of questions. Mr. Costello.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Captain Trafton, let me ask you about the dual role that the AST has as both regulating and promoting the industry. As you know, for many years, the FAA had the responsibility of promoting commercial aviation as well as regulating commercial airlines, and because of conflicts along the way, the Congress, as a result of those conflicts, decided to change the role of the FAA, and instead of promoting commercial aviation, which we felt that the airlines could do very well on their own, that we did not need, the federal government did not need to be promoting commercial aviation or the airlines, we said that you should be a regulatory agency and change their responsibility. Do you have a concern about the dual responsibility of the AST?
Mr. Costello, at this time I don't. I don't see a conflict today in those two roles. In industry, you've heard that the industry, I think, can use the help from AST today. In fact, they sponsor in cooperation with AIAA an annual conference, which was just held here in February. Very well attended, great exchange of information. Those kinds of events are good for the industry. Now, down the road, when the industry is more mature, absolutely we should probably take a hard look at whether or not AST should be promoting commercial space.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Nield, more and more we hear about man-made orbital debris and the threat it poses to satellites, the International Space Station, and to crewed capsules. Going forward, what can be done to prevent the creation of additional orbital debris? And I guess I'll ask, what measures, if any, are spacefaring nations considering to eliminate the creation of orbital debris, and to what degree has your office looked at this issue?
We've certainly looked at it. However, as you know, we actually do not have on-orbit authority today. Our congressional authority is restricted to launch and reentry. However, because the on-orbit phase is why you're doing the mission, it's important to understand what's going on. There have been a number of international discussions about proposed guidelines of what altitudes are appropriate for various satellites, if there are certain lifetimes that should be enforced. But we currently do not have requirements in place today for our commercial providers along those lines. Some of the things that you can do would be to carefully select the orbits that you're planning to fly to. Once the mission is complete, you could look at either re-entering the satellite or boosting it up to a higher altitude so that you're not clogging up that orbital altitude with debris and used up satellites.
What about upper stages that are discarded upon launch?
That is a source of a significant amount of on-orbit objects right now.
Okay. Ms. Edwards, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. Dr. Nield, in your prepared statement, you note with regard to commercial human spaceflight that based on market studies, we expect to see this type of activity result in $1 billion industry within the next 10 years. Can you tell me what the basis is of your estimate and what percentage of that estimate involves purely private, non-government customers?
Yes, all of it involves non-government private customers. The basis for the figure is actually a study that was done by the Futron Corporation in recent years. And rather than just going down the street and asking who would like to fly in space, they did a careful assessment of potential customers who had the disposable income or the savings that would be able to afford these rather expensive tickets these days, and how many of them would be interested in flying if such a vehicle were made available. And so that would form the basis for a lot of these projections. And just I would point out that Virgin Galactic, which is one of the companies that is involved in this right now, already has almost 500 people who have put down either partial deposits or paid for a full ticket, and that's raised $60 million before the flights have even begun.
If part of the estimate is people who'd like to come, we've heard claims that the industry's been expected to begin operations within a few years, in the next several years, but some companies haven't even begun test flights yet. So I'm curious as to how we can have confidence that the industry is going to grow to the level that you indicated. And on top of that, are we going to do we have to move to a point where we have a huge regulatory structure in place to handle an industry that we don't know really is going to mature in the kind of way that a new regulatory agency and body and oversight responsibilities would entail?
That will be a very big challenge, and we certainly want to work with the Congress as we make progress year by year in the industry to see, do we have the right amount of resources? Do we have the right level of regulatory oversight? Frankly, it's very hard to predict how many of these companies are going to be successful. We're dealing with a dozen companies right now that are planning to develop vehicles to be part of this industry, but we know that all of them will not be successful. Some are going to run out of money, some are going to find technical challenges, but there are enough good people and enough private funds and government programs that are investing in these areas that we're pretty confident that we're seeing the beginning of a significant upswing.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and statements from members. The witnesses are excused, and this hearing is adjourned.